All right, team. Welcome to the first lecture of sport management. So, since this is the beginning of the class and we're in the introductory period, the first chapter talks about the history of sport management. And before you actually start to watch this video, I would encourage you to go ahead and watch the short video that I put out that gave you some background on myself as well as the class and then went through the syllabus. So just in case you have not watched that introductory video, which is on Blackboard, and I'll make sure to send a email or announcement giving you that link. My name is Jeff Levine. I am a new sport management professor here in the Department of Kinesiology, and I am thrilled to be your professor. So with this chapter right here, it should not take too long, and it's designed to kind of give you a quick and dirty history into sport management. And there are some overarching themes here about the history of sport management. And actually, before we even start about talking about this, I would recommend that for every chapter that's in the Principles and Practice of Sport Management textbook, to make sure to look at the objectives that are on the first page of each chapter. You can use those objectives to guide you as you read the chapter and as you watch the PowerPoint. Also, you'll probably notice that I drink a lot of coffee. So not far from any video lecture or any computer I have will be a coffee cup. For me, coffee is life-giving and life-sustaining. So if you poked me, coffee would probably come out. So hopefully that never comes to pass, though. Hopefully we don't test that theory. So okay, getting back to the introduction here. Sport management and the structures of sport management come in different building blocks. Traditionally, the building blocks of sport management, or the management side of sport from a general sense, came in the form of clubs, leagues, and professional tournaments. Now, each of these mechanisms developed in response to different social or cultural events that were occurring within that region of the world. You'll see that clubs were more popular in the European societies, and things like tournaments and leagues were more popular in the newer societies of the West, such as the United States or North America. And we'll talk about why that was the case. But as I said, structures within sport management would grow in response to what was going on within each society and the changes that were resulting or that were occurring to address social issues. And another overarching theme here from a secondary perspective is this emphasis on honesty and an emphasis on inclusion. Traditionally speaking, the who was able to participate in sports was a function of who was a person of privilege. And a person of privilege usually was an older white male. But as society liberalized and demands in social responses led to a change in society, we also saw that inclusion increased and more people from different races, creeds, social classes, genders were able to gain equitable access to sport, which then required a change within how that sport is managed. And we'll talk about honest play later in this lecture, but that's also a very important overarching theme. So, okay, the origins of sport management structure, as I said, are within three different buckets: club, league, and tournament. So with club, that came in the form of European society that was established in um, in England. And it was the birthplace of sport management from a sort of modern history perspective. And one of the driving reasons why England played such a large role in the establishment of sport management sort of governance was because of the British Empire. Like I said initially, society, how a sport management structure responded was based on society and changes in societal structures. So initially, the British Empire really used the power of sport to socialize and Europeanize the different societies that they conquered. So when the British military came to conquer that distant land, it would also bring things like association football, which was soccer that we understand in our terms, cricket, and similar types of stick sports that led to the creation of baseball, things like rugby and other British sports that now are popularized throughout the world. And that's because these cultures that were colonized also adopted British culture. And we also look to see how the club system was used to govern these different sports that were spread throughout the diaspora due to the British Empire. So we see in the 18th century that sports clubs begin to pop up around a great deal of Europe, centered in England. And these sports clubs are based on the notion that people who are of noble descent or uh, high net worth individuals, people who were rich, were able to have membership within these sports clubs. But the commoner, someone who was not of aristocracy, not a noble, could not partake. And then, because of sort of the hierarchy of traditional English society, people who were of noble stature would choose to put on exhibitions involving their sport in which their club belonged in to entertain the masses. And these nobles did not charge. That the fact that they did not charge and that they participated for the sport, for the glory, what made it seem as though these nobles were beyond reproach, that they were pure. And then in the 19th century, we see a continued evolution of a club system to where clubs actually moved to standardize rules and engage in governance as a way to clean up the sport as technology began to make it so that these sports popularized and that the geographic reach of each club became more to the point that different clubs could have interactions and stage different races. So that, with that thought in mind of club sports, this led to the creation, or this led to the popularization of thoroughbred racing. One thing I should also mention about club sport that survives to this day, because the notion of the club as a part of the community and it serves the community. This led to the creation of different levels of that club association. So people participating in a sport, whether it's cricket or association football, they would start off playing the sport young within their community, and then they would rise through the ranks from amateur all the way up to professional, and that really survives in some way, shape, or form today, although the textbook mentions that some of the European sport clubs are now being professionalized and turned into American versions, but we can talk about that a little bit later. But with thoroughbred racing, these races, because they were being staged across the region, they drew a broad and diverse audience because Thoroughbred racing was again looked at aristocracy, and it was the rich entertaining the commoners, and the commoners believe that these races were legitimate, that they would believe that there was no unethical conduct going on or cheating going on, which as technology increased and the sophistication of the sport increased, there was the greater opportunity to cheat because gambling was becoming more popular at this time. But the nobles were thought to be beyond reproach. And because they were a higher ilk of society, there was no thought that any cheating would be involved, and there was no financial element for the nobles. So this led to the nobles serving a role as sort of the administrators who would act as the guardian of thoroughbred racing and other sports. One of the clubs that was very popular within thoroughbred racing was the Jockey Club. And so the Jockey Club is famous because they took that extra step of establishing rules and standards for thoroughbred governance, and they had identified this need for a national governing body. And by bringing all of the groups together and creating these standardized rules, that helped to, again, establish and solidify the legitimacy of that sport. Now, we see the NCAA, who regulates college athletics, serving a very similar role of standardizing governance and providing rules and a mechanism to resolve disputes within college athletics. So you can see some of the governance responsibilities that the Jockey Club took on, and it also served as a model for wider sport management practices in England and within different sports, different things like cricket, like soccer, and things with and fencing. So the Jockey Club was instrumental in doing that. Now, if we go across the pond and we look at the American structure, we see that it differs radically from the traditional European club structure because, quite frankly, the United States lacked that aristocratic tradition that the nobles of England and Europe had, that they were above the fray, that they could not be bribed by or swayed by financial interests. Because with the American structures, it looked more from these structures looked more like a business or trying to generate revenue. And the field or the sport of thoroughbred racing was not nearly as popular as the American invention of harness racing. And harness racing, as the textbook mentions, became popular because virtually every person in America who was of age owned a horse and buggy, and that they could actually enter into harness races, and it was an easy to understand sport, and the distance of travel for the race was much shorter than with thoroughbred racing. So this made it a better spectator sport, and because the races lasted a less period of time, shorter period of time, that meant that the promoters and the track owners could stage more races to increase the attractiveness of these races. And by increasing the attractiveness and popularity, the people who were vested in promoting and being business people associated with harness racing could charge admission fees. So these tracks in the sport were managed by the track owners and the race promoters, and they were even willing to give the most popular harness racers a cut of the money that was gotten from the admission fee. However, this close association between track owners and promoters and then some of the people who participated in the races, and that appearance of impropriety, because the whole point of the sport was, from their standpoint, was to get the most amount of people to come watch the event, and that would run up the admission fee. Jockeys were suspected of staging the races and throwing the races so that there would be as many races as possible in that series. You needed to win 2 out of the 3 races in order to be the champion. So if the racers, the promoters, and the owner and the track owner could collude and maximize the amount of races 3, that led to issues of credibility. And because of that lack of British aristocracy or European aristocracy to show that they were above the fray, management actually was unable to show that they were unbiased or that they were ethical, and therefore that led to the fall of harness racing, because once the crowds suspected that the races were staged, people became less interested, became not a true sport, because the outcome was no longer in doubt. It was just a choreographed ballet. And with that lack of certainty, once the lack of certainty left, then the attractiveness of this sport went away. So we take that lesson from harness racing, the cautionary tale of harness racing, and we see that lives on today. And we've got several examples of situations where we no longer have the aristocracy from Europe, and we have the business owners who are trying to show that they're above the fray. And now the business owners are the wealthy elite and the professional sports leagues, and they're trying very hard to convince the spectators and the people who pay to go to these games that the outcomes of their contests are always in doubt. That the competition is authentic. So that kind of brings us to why the NFL fought. Why did the NFL fight so hard to punish the New England Patriots and Tom Brady because of Deflategate? Well, the NFL did not want to provide the appearance of impropriety. They didn't want to show that or give the consumer any reason to think or believe that the games are staged or fixed at all, because once that sort of creeping thought goes into the head of the spectator or consumer, they very well might be less likely to go to that event or support that event, because the outcome and whether or not the outcome is actually ever in doubt, that might prevent them from believing the sport is legitimate. So we also have a similar example that happened about 8 years ago or 9 years ago, involving Tim Donaghy, who is a NBA referee, who was arrested and pled guilty to various crimes because he gambled on the games that he was refereeing, and it came out that he was actually making foul calls in order to influence the spread. If you can make that out in that picture, it says Donaghy, refs are told by NBA to foul certain players. So just that statement shakes the core legitimacy of the NBA to its core. The core legitimacy to its core. It shakes its core legitimacy because, again, if the fans believe that the winner of the game has already been predetermined, then why even bother watching the game whatsoever? The outcome is not in doubt. So this is why leagues try to protect the integrity of their product. And also it's why us as a society seem more likely to accept a sport where players are cheating to win the game as opposed to people associated with the game, whether it's players or managers or referees, are cheating to make it so that the outcome of the game is actually already predetermined. We don't like that. We like competition. So with that loss of doubt in terms of who might win, that makes it that makes the value of the game from our perspective much less. And these leagues do not want the same thing to happen to harness racing to happen to them. So we now move to leagues as sort of the model way that professional sports has been driven in the United States. So baseball was the first sport to move to a league system, and the Red Stockings were the first professional team. They had enjoyed a multi-year streak of barnstorming where they won every game. But at the time when the Red Stockings were barnstorming, and this is in the late 1800s, problems began to exist because some teams were paying their players as professionals, which was looked down upon in some respects, and some were purely amateurs, but they were not playing on the same. They were not on the same playing field, as well as some teams would be in a league and stop playing, and some teams would not pay their players even though they promised to. But there was all kinds of problems. And in 1871, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players was created, and it was created as a way to help standardize the game and legitimize the game so that there was an appearance of professionalism and that everyone was going to be on the same playing field. Now, William Hulbert became the first czar of baseball who took over management of the National League of Professional Baseball Players. And again, his focus was running these sports leagues as a business. So using basic business principles like making sure that teams were prohibited from colluding against with each other, like what happened in harness racing. We don't want the outcomes to be questioned. We want each team to really be competing against each other on a level playing field. And Hulbert was able to get a variety of initial members from different cities. And Hulbert understood that the success of these leagues was dependent on the appearance of honest competition, that teams should not be able to start a season and then quit just because they were losing money, or that some teams would be completely out of some teams would be completely uncompetitive, which would decrease the value of the product on the field. So instead, Hulbert included these nuanced changes that were able to feed upon the values of society at that time. Again, this is Hulbert responding to society's beliefs and the changing values of society in order to effectively manage the game or the league. So he put out schedules so that teams would play more than just one game, that it would be a series of games throughout the season, and that he also outlawed betting in ballparks, which comported well with the Puritan and Victorian beliefs of that era. And with the attempt to increase the morality of baseball, he also prohibited beer sales and penalized any team that chose to sell beer by kicking them out of the league. Also, no games on Sundays. He also increased the cost of ticket prices to get rid of quote-unquote undesirables so that they could not afford going to these games. He limited the amount of teams for the talent and and instituted player contracts and the reserve clause within those contracts so that players there would be consistency and continuity in those teams, so and that each play all the leagues would actually, or I'm sorry, that teams would actually have players. He also created these exclusive territories where each team had an X amount of radius where they could be the only team in that league to play, and that helped create civic pride between the city and the team. Hulbert also worked to encourage media to cover these games, and he also created elements of revenue sharing. Many of these lessons, these implementations from Hulbert, are still felt today. He proceeded to persuade teams and owners of those teams to think in the long term, not in the short term. Look to what is in the best interest of the baseball league itself as opposed to the individual teams. And that sort of thinking still exists today. That is how the National Football League went from a marginal league that was behind the Major League Baseball in terms of popularity now to one of the most lucrative leagues in the world by conducting business by thinking about what is in the best interests of the league. Also, he limited the number of teams to help with competitive balance, because competitive balance is the thought process that if every team can potentially win the game, then it makes it exciting for as a maximum amount of people as possible, and every team is still in it. Hulbert also created the concept of the pennant race, so that it's a series of games in a season, and even if the team in last place is not performing that well, there's enough games in the season to think, hey, that team can still turn it around and be successful. And the concept of exclusive territories still exists today, and revenue sharing exists today. So Hulbert's impact is still being felt, and he was somewhat of a visionary when it comes to leagues. And one of the sort of last things here is that he was able to substitute the notion of aristocracy or European nobles with the creation of central leagues that were sort of the impartial noble who was safeguarding the best interests of the sport and was charged with things like governance, dispute resolution, and the like. And again, this question, why is integrity so important to the success of a sports league? Well, we talked about it about the Brady Deflategate saga and the Tim Donaghy betting scandal. It's that if the integrity of the league is compromised through betting or through any sort of impropriety, then the public will begin to question the legitimacy of these contests, just like what happened in the infamous Black Sox scandal, where multiple Chicago White Sox players were arrested for throwing the World Series because they got paid by the mafia to throw the World Series. The mafia actually had bet on it, and it almost killed baseball because people were beginning to question the integrity of the game. So the final system here is professional sports tournaments. And this is somewhat rooted in the club system, and it came from the United States, where early tournaments would be sponsored by private clubs, and they benefited the members of those clubs. So we had professional athletes who would come to the club and gain their permission to partake in a tournament, but in that the clubs usually got some sort of payment. And oftentimes these employees were the ones often worked at the clubs as a pro or someone who was charged with maintaining the course. Professional golf, at its inception, was staffed by these golf professionals and who had a day job as instructors and caddies, and they were usually brought from Europe to help design, implement, maintain, and coach the members on how to play golf. And these professional leagues failed to get public interest or attract public golfers or attract professionals because the professionals really weren't interested in leaving their secure jobs as the golf pro or in the caddy for something speculative for a small purse. So there was also no attempt at generating revenues from a gate because the excitement level really wasn't there. So instead of looking at generating revenue from the gate like club sports had or harness racing had or leagues had, we saw a movement towards looking at the outside world, looking at corporations and other sorts of high net worth individuals who might be interested in what are called corporate sponsorships. And this was pioneered by Fred Corcoran. And so he, with both the PGA and the LPGA, worked with these entities and with golf equipment manufacturers to create golf tournaments and showcase them as events for corporate entities to advertise in a way that avoided taxes. It would, by paying for these corporate sponsorships, it was a way to pay to a nonprofit and not be taxed on that sponsorship or that advertisement. As part of creating the PGA and LPGA so that tournaments can be created, these organizations, these private entities, help to standardize the rules of golf and organize golf and then create purses for the winners of the tournament. And cities were encouraged to host these tournaments. Why would a city want to host a tournament? Well, as it says in the textbook, it was a way to promote the cause of someone from the city, or maybe gain exposure and advertisement for people to come for tourism reasons. If a city paid $3,000 for the right to host the tournament, and maybe there's other ancillary costs, the city and its businesses would reap much more money through hotels, food, gas, other fees. That was the argument. Corcoran's model is still used in sports today. Now, we kind of close here by talking about the evolution of baseball stadiums, because baseball is symbolic of the other professional sports within the United States. Again, as sport has shifted from something of a club and community endeavor, where it was in Europe and to some extent in the United States, and then it was morphed into a for-profit business, the facility that the organization or team uses also had to evolve. And we see the changes in architecture of the stadium and what amenities are available in the location of that stadium. So, for example, and I invite you to Google these. Compare the architecture of Fenway Park or original Yankee Stadium or Tiger Stadium with the stadiums that were created in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. These large dome stadiums that were usually in suburban areas. Whereas The original stadiums that were constructed, the late 1800s or early 1900s, were usually in a downtown city region, urban area, had less seating, less bells and whistles, 20,000, 30,000, versus more modern stadiums from the 80s that were 40, 50, 60,000 people, meant for mixed use, to host multiple types of sports and have multiple amenities. And now think about the types of stadiums that we see being created today, such as Reliant Field in Houston, or New Yankee Stadium, or Ford Field in Detroit, or the new Detroit Red Wings Stadium. These are all with amenities for revenue maximization, and they're oftentimes part of an approach to create a mixed-use real estate development that has residential space for living and shopping. But this is an attempt to try to maximize revenue, because again, as sport has evolved from something that was done for nonprofit reasons or for the love of the game, now sports are played in order to maximize the revenues. And there's a few questions down here that you can look at on your own. And that pretty much takes us to the end of this chapter here. So some important takeaways here are to know that the sport industry demands that managers understand the context and complexity of the history of sport management, and that clubs, leagues, and tournaments have all been created and evolved in response to the unique changes within society that differ based on location and the society that we live in, what is important to that society. So that's pretty much it for today. Kept it a little bit short. Make sure that you do the discussion board question and any other assignments. Also, make sure to pay attention to Blackboard, and we will see you for next week's class. Thanks, and I hope you have a great week.